So I feel like I'd like to start again as if we have had a break, and we have had a break, just to say what an absolute delight this conference has been, how stimulating and, almost brilliant and shimmering in so many ways. Just really, really, really wonderful. So I'm delighted, as I'm sure many of you are. This evening, as my title says, I'm going to offer 14 reflections after some 32 years, with apologies to everything and everyone I've been compelled for want of time to leave out, to set aside. There's so much that has been rumbling through my mind for a long, long time, but I'm going to just give you some little bits and pieces. Number one, I'm here first of all to applaud our vast, diverse, lively, and talented array of creative and critical voices. What a pleasure to see all the new and not so new writers, critics, readers, who by being here have expressed interest in Mennonite literature and in this phenomenon called Mennonites writing. Those two things I will argue, I'll argue right now and not have to repeat it too much. They're not interchangeable, absolutely, but you'll see what I mean. Mennonites writing, a project, an institution, you might say, that began in another century, in another country, some 32 years ago. I was there then, along with a few other stalwarts present tonight, and I'm thrilled and grateful that the excitement persists over 3 decades on. I do want to say at the outset that I'll be speaking to the provenance of these conferences, though I will, alas, not have time to mention them all, and that I recognize, of course, that I am addressing only a small corner of the whole tradition, the whole wide and ever-widening world of Mennonites writing. So, where to begin? The call for papers, which in 2020 invited us to reflect back on the history of Mennonites writing, struck me in a particular way because I was then deeply immersed in gathering and organizing boxes of papers, flyers, letters, files, manuscripts, and ephemera concerned with Mennonite writing. These are things I had assembled over more than 30 years, mostly from a pre-digital era. This was an assemblage I imagine might someday deliver a glimpse into people, places, and events in the life of a vibrant literary enterprise. Throughout my academic life, I've been deeply interested in literary communities. My aim in 2020 was to provide something of a context for an ongoing movement warmly responded to by conference participants like all of us here, and those who attended any of the past 8 events in this series. Probably few people can now recall the earliest factors that helped to shape over these past decades our enduring communal embrace of a literary phenomenon that extends, I believe, well beyond a particular collection of texts. Tonight, I'll offer you a few scattered comments about the early times, but I want to look forward too. The future of this movement, we can see this, is extraordinarily bright. The present moment offers and will continue to offer so much from so many of you and others. That being so, I hope you'll allow me to augment my forward look with a wee look back to certain things that have occupied me for a long time and continue to draw my attention. I'm aware that my reflections emerge from a particular critical, historical, even chronological, cultural, even geographic perspective. And I'm honored to have the opportunity to invite you along on this brief, probably idiosyncratic, personal journey. 2, one of the lovely or scary things that happen when you get older is that you might find yourself a bearer of institutional memory. The institution I speak of here is not explicitly Mennonite literature, the originary claims and very meaning of which have precipitated a lot of critical debate in recent years. Nor is it a community of writers I'm referring to, which one can surely find and applaud here. I refer rather to a literary community that includes writers and everyone else, readers and mentors, critics, editors, reviewers, publishers, graphic designers, copy editors, bookstore buyers, bloggers, patrons and funders, readings hosts, and conference organizers. All those figures we assemble in our minds when we speak of this project called Mennonites Writing, the robust nature of which we are bearing witness to here at Goshen. This is the institution about which I have so many memories, and collectively we are gathering so many more memories by the minute, here and now. 3, we've come together for 9 conferences to date. There was a time when Ann Hostetler and/or Jeff Gundy and I would preside at plenary sessions to report on what we called the state of the art, what was happening in the field on each side of the Canadian-American border. We were more conscious of the border then, before we began to reframe our thinking about how literatures operate in and across the world. 6 of these conferences have taken place in the US. Even the first in Waterloo in 1990 attracted, alongside a host of Canadian Mennonite readers, writers, critics, and benignly curious, though remarkably enthusiastic, non-Mennonite Canadian writers, editors, academics, and publishers, American Mennonites like Irvin Beck, Jeff Gundy, Julia Kasdorf, Sherry Hostetler, for example, all of whom are here this week, and Nick Lindsay, the larger-than-life mentor of Goshen poets. And there were older Americans, too, who, unlike the younger members of the late 20th century crowd, the late 20th century crowd in Western Canada, for example, had been working more or less in isolation, but tenaciously. The pioneering poet and critic Elmer Zuderman, for one, and Cincinnati's Dallas Wiebe, who was so surprised and excited to have found a family of Mennonite readers and writers that he took every opportunity at that first conference to bomb any photograph that included his imaginary brothers, Armin Wiebe and Rudy Wiebe. It was Dallas who, in his tribute to Elmer Zuderman here in Goshen in 1997, declared that it was Dallas, did I say that, who in his tribute to Elmer in Goshen in 1997 declared that it was Elmer who was, quote, the first person who took the idea of a Mennonite literature seriously at a time in the late 1940s when no one else seemed to consider it a possibility. 4, I was quite fearful about coming to this conference, Rudy Wiebe observed in his inimitable declarative voice on the panel at the end of that first conference those many years ago. Patrick Friesen that same day declared, I hate conferences quite a bit. Patrick, within a week, sent me a letter written on a pale blue 8.5 by 11 stock that was his brand, a letter full of emotive ellipses. He wrote, Menno writing won't be the same, and almost as important, Menno's won't be the same. Something happened, a major shift happened, or rather, a recognition of a shift that has already happened. Di Brandt sent a characteristically breathless note, accented with little hand drawings and punctuated with ampersands, stating that she had left the conference, quote, feeling so moved and so very loved and being listened to by the Mennonites at last that it will be a long time for me to return to normal life. Several prominent specialists in Canadian literature who came to the conference from major universities were ecstatic about what they observed as the explosive energy and almost uncanny intimacy they felt in the group. An intimacy engineered and supported by the fact that all of our sessions were plenary, so we all shared everything that went on. These Canadianists loved being party to the familiarity and passion that Robert Crouch, the closing panel chair, characterized as an intense family quarrel. The conference threatens to be a landmark event, Crouch had written Kim Jernigan, editor of the New Quarterly, the conference sponsor, in anticipation the year before. Afterwards, Crouch sent a postcard to me just to say the conference was everything I expected and more, he wrote. The sense of delight lingers on. As for Rudy Wiebe, he would participate in every conference after that first one until 2017, when, too frail to attend, he sent this message: "I will miss Mennonites writing very much. If you have a chance, give the conference my warmest Low German greetings. Alle Beste, all the best." He would have loved, he wrote last week, to be here with us now. 5. The Mennonites Writing Project, this institution, was from the beginning thoroughly woven into the world. It began in the fall of 1987 with a casual conversation between Kim Jernigan and me on the campus of the University of Waterloo. Kim Jernigan, an American who had moved to Waterloo from Boston, was a committed student of Canadian literature. And by the time she and I spoke of hosting that 1990 event, she had been editor of the New Quarterly since 1981. When we broached the subject of hosting a conference on Mennonite literature, each of us was poised to explore the explosion of literary texts that would later be identified by Andrus Taskins, editor of the magazine Prairie Fire, as the Mennonite miracle. It had been several years since Patrick Friesen, Victor Enns, Armin Wiebe, Sandra Birdsall, and close to 20 Mennonite and non-Mennonite others in 1981 had gathered at Victor Enns' brother's farm to found the Manitoba Writers Guild and mark the advance of the great surge of Mennonite writing in Canada. 6. In Canada, then, in the late 1980s, Mennonite writers were on their way to claiming a significant place in a literary world where Canadian literature had barely secured a place for itself. There were no Canadian literature courses being offered in Canadian universities when I was an undergraduate in the 1960s. CanLit was offered, if at all, as a 2-week unit at the end of a full course on American literature. For my grad course in Canadian literature in the 70s, the prof, one of the few CanLit specialists in the country then, flew in weekly from another university over 700 miles away. But by the 1980s, Canadians found themselves occupying a new age of cultural nationalism, when festivals and conferences featuring literary critics and writers could depend on funding from various national bodies interested in sponsoring what had become an explosion of Canadian literature, where Mennonite writing was emerging as a vigorous player. So along with a few private donors, that first conference drew funds and encouragement from the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council of Canada, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Secretary of State for Multiculturalism, the Writers' Union of Canada, and the League of Canadian Poets, all the significant national bodies. 7. It was Kim Jernigan, the New Quarterly editor, who selected Robert Croach to preside over the conference's closing panel. Croach had taught at SUNY Binghamton for several years, where he had co-founded the avant-garde literary journal Boundary 2. Croach, a scholar, poet, novelist, and generous mentor, who was known in literary circles for delivering postmodernism to Canadian English departments, directly influenced numerous Mennonites who studied with him during those years, including Sandra Birdsall, Armin Wiebe, and Victor Enns. By 1990, he was well settled into Winnipeg as an English professor at the University of Manitoba, where he had become a close associate of the founders of Turnstone Press, which during the 1980s had published a stunning number of titles by Mennonite writers. Turnstone, founder David Arneson declared at that first conference, was not interested in what he called the Mennonite thing. It would just so happen that there were so many fine writers in Manitoba, and it just so happened that so many of them were Mennonite. His Turnstone colleague and fellow founder Dennis Cooley, however, had put things differently to me in a letter a year earlier. "We're hooked on Mennonites," he wrote, amidst jokes about there being schools of Mennonite writers like schools of fish, swimming, as he put it, across Lake Agassiz. the body of water that looms so large in Manitoba fictions of Sandra Burtzel. Turnstone Press remains a formidable publisher of Mennonite writers, including, in recent years, Joanne Epp, Sarah Enns, Dora Duick, Andrew Unger, and others. Later this month, Turnstone Press will release a volume of new and selected poems by Di Brandt entitled The Sweetest Dance on Earth. You can visit the launch online. In 1988, 2 years before that first conference, 2 years before the first conference on Mennonite writing, Conrad Grebel College had hosted a conference on Mennonite identity, where I, a new faculty member at the college then, gave a paper on the role of art and literature in Mennonite self-understanding. In this paper, I made reference to some 20 mostly Canadian writers and visual artists who were just then making a remarkable impact in the fields of literature and the visual arts. And I listed their accomplishments and awards. Goshen's Irvin Beck and Bluffton's Jeff Gundy were present there, and Gundy, ever the modest Ohio, or is it Illinois, Amishman, would on more than one occasion afterwards remark on how appalled he had been by the lack of humility this young Russian Mennonite woman revealed while she so brashly recited her list of award-winning creators. We used to talk quite a bit about the differences between ostensibly imperious Canadian Russian and apparently modest American Swiss Mennonites. Thankfully, that debate has been replaced by other tropes. Through those two Waterloo conferences in 88 and 90, American literary figures like Gundy and Beck had become aware of the remarkable momentum of Mennonite literary production in Canada. In November 1997, after the first Goshen Conference, which was number 2 in the series, Gundy expressed relief that Mennonite writing in the U.S. was finally beyond the point where when 2 or 3 American writers would get together, they'd say, "Wouldn't it be great if we had something like the Canadians?" It's not every day a Canadian can say, hey, you know, we got there first. If I had time, and Jeff Gundy would allow me an immodest gesture, I would recite another list of some of the new generation of literary luminaries who I am grateful to say occupy large spaces in our consciousness throughout the continent and beyond. Casey Plett, Miriam Taves, Rachel Yoder, and Sophia Samatar, to name just a few. I just happened to see, when I went back to the hotel for a few minutes this afternoon, that Time magazine today issued a list of 12 new books you should read in September, and listed alongside new titles by Louise Glick, Barbara Kingsolver, and Paul Newman is The White Mosque by Sophia Samatar. I don't know if Sophia's here. She told me she had to catch a train. Oh, yeah. Number 9. About that first Goshen Conference in 1997, in May 95, Irvin Beck wrote a letter in which he let me know that he and others had been inspired to plan a conference on Mennonite writing in the U.S. The 1990 conference had been explicitly focused on Mennonite writing in Canada. And would I mind if they used our brand, Mennonite/S writing, where the slash in the first word allowed it to function both as a noun and an adjective, while the second word served as a noun and a verb. I say Irvin wrote a letter because there was no email then, and long-distance phoning would have been too expensive and too intimate. Irvin copied that letter to Jeff Gundy, Jean Jansen, Julia Kasdorf, Al Reimer, and Elmer Zuderman. And near the end, he wrote, "Elmer, this was your idea. We are counting on advice from you." So Irvin Beck, spurred on by Elmer Zuderman, went ahead and planned and delivered in 1997 Mennonites Writing 2, Mennonites Writing in the U.S. The conference was a roaring success. One of the memorable events of that conference for me was when Irvin, at a lunch immediately after the last session, introduced me to his brilliant and energetic new colleague, Anne Hostetler, who he said would become a formidable player in the Mennonite writing project. Indeed. And this time I followed it with an exclamation mark. None of what we have experienced here throughout these days could have happened without Anne. I mean, really, you can sometimes overstate these things. I am not overstating. Whose work on this event, as on so many fronts related to what we're doing here, has been prodigious and fabulous. Thank you, Anne. I recall also being lured away at that first Goshen conference by another Goshen English professor, Shirley Showalter, who was very excited, she probably doesn't remember this, to show me something in her faculty office. She tapped a few keys on her desktop computer to invoke something I had never seen before. This, she declared excitedly, pointing to the computer screen, is the World Wide Web. And a few more taps on the keyboard, and this is the web page of Goshen College. I could not then imagine that complexity, the complexity of the new age we were embarking upon, with its myriad advantages and disadvantages from the perspective of the worlds of literature. 10. It was Wayne Tefts, another of the founders of Turnstone Press, who observed in the closing panel of the 1990 conference that there were already 3 or 4 generations of writers active in the field. To be sure, alongside the brilliant younger writers who would form the Mennonite Miracle were a number of what I'll call middle-aged academics in Winnipeg who had been looking for ways to feature work produced by mostly German-speaking Canadian Mennonite writers of fiction and poetry of a still older generation of authors. At that 1990 conference, 2 of those elder statesmen, both had been my teachers, one in high school, one at university, Harry Lowen, editor of the Journal of Mennonite Studies, and novelist and critic Al Reimer, gave papers where their focus was on German language texts, and that did not seem out of place. No one took issue with Lowen's tracing the origins of Mennonite writing to Canadian German poetry of the 1860s, nor with Reimer's statement that it was Arnold Dick who, with his German language prose, spearheaded the literary movement that for the first time gave Canadian Mennonites a coherent literary image of themselves. 11. I am going to use a little bit of this. Some years ago, I began to look into Mennonite literary activity in German, particularly as it appeared in the several German language serials that had served to create, well into the 20th century, webs of connection among Mennonites of North America. I recently had reason to consult one of these, Zionsbote, a 16-page weekly published in the USA from 1884 to 1964. The index revealed that over the course of 80 years, this journal had published 700 poems, not including occasional poems related to events like Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter. Quite apart from the questionable literary quality, if we can speak of these things, of some of their contents, serial publications like Zionsbote or Die Mennonitische Rundschau, 1880 to 2007, and others distributed broadly among Mennonites in North America, with subscriptions in Europe and Russia as well, at once exerted a substantial, though perhaps from our perspective today provocative, community-building force, and confirmed that the distinctive traditions these periodicals were striving to serve were reflective of a literate, if not decidedly literary, culture. I was intrigued those many years ago to discover also, concealed, one could say, in serial publications of the sort one might tend not to revisit after their immediate appearance, an abundance of material in English related to the literary activities of Mennonites. After combing through periodicals from Mennonite Mirror, Mennonite Life, Festival Quarterly, to Canadian Fiction Magazine, Journal of Canadian Poetry, Grain, Malahat Review, I could go on, in search of poems and stories, articles, and reviews related to Mennonite writing, my student research assistants created a bibliography that includes some 3,000 references to work by and about Mennonite writing in North America in the 20th century. These fugitive, I'll call them, texts that could be seen to form a complex but too often neglected substructure for our own literary tradition, don't quite comprise what critic Franco Moretti evocatively or provocatively calls the slaughterhouse of literature. But we might regard them as Mennonite literature's rich, uncharted expanse and consider them worth revisiting. 12. It's interesting to observe that German has remained a palpable presence in Mennonite writing, especially in the texture of code switching, evident in the work of writers like Rudy Wiebe and Patrick Fries and Di Brandt, Audrey Petker, Jessica Penner, Armand Wiebe, and others who grew up surrounded by German and or Low German. To this day, Rudy Wiebe closes personal letters to those he knows know German, not with all the best, but rather Olet Basta, the Low German equivalent. The fact that Rob Zacharias devoted 1/5 of his very interesting recent critical commentary on Mennonite writing to a diary translated from German suggests that at least some of us are open to directing our attention to German language texts, Canadian Russländer in particular, because of their immigration history, are, after all, not far from their German Mennonite heritage and its literary activities. 21,000, Americans might not know this, 21,000 Russländer arrived in Canada in the 1920s, a period when the USA accepted no immigrants from Ukraine. If we are to enlarge the landscape of Mennonites writing, as both Magdalene Redekop's and Rob Zacharias' recent critical studies suggest we do, we might once more include German language texts in our consideration of Mennonite literary productions. After all, as Rob Zacharias suggests, the language marker that confirmed our ethnic status decades ago can now be submitted as evidence of our being legitimately transnational, a label we might embrace or not. And consider here at the conference this weekend Bradley Schmidt's presentations on and of German Mennonite fiction. And I've heard other references in papers to German work. We look forward, of course, in the meantime, to accessing also Mennonite writing in a plethora of other languages, including Spanish, for example, as more non-English texts become available to us from around the Mennonite world. If we integrate German language texts into our field of study, we might take seriously not only the numerous volumes of poems published in German for well over a century, but also respond productively to both Redekop's and Zacharias' urging that we direct more critical attention towards life writing, which would involve, of course, consulting beyond the sorts of fugitive periodical literature to which I'm referring, memoirs and letters we might find in archives. There is, after all, a plethora of literary material in libraries and archives that remains to be examined as critical, as creative work, emerging from the literary heart of Mennonite communities. Critics of Mennonite writing have tended to focus on the published text, the independently bound text, not the individual, often isolated pieces found in periodicals. We have tended not to focus on diaries, letters, memoirs, least of all those tucked away in archives. But these sorts of texts are slowly beginning to emerge from their lesser rank as genres of liminal status. Over the past year and a half, I've been more than ever struck by the value and impact of just such seemingly arcane literary texts. If only I had paid more attention years ago. I just want to add a footnote here that I know people like Connie Brown, for example, and others are in fact using archives, but it's not something that we're doing a lot of. Number 13, just as the train goes by. I'm always reminded I used to teach Prairie Canadian literature and Prairie literature in particular, and the train, of course, undoubtedly in the U.S. as well, is always a symbol of a means of escape, a way of getting out. Oh, and it even whistles. 13. On a cold February morning during the pandemic lockdown in 2021, I suggested to my husband, Paul, that I would like to open, finally, 2 large dark blue metal steamer trunks that had been stored in our basement by a then-deceased family member. All I knew about their contents was that they contained family memorabilia. What I found has occupied, indeed obsessed me for the past year and a half. The 2 trunks were full to overflowing with textual material, most of it in German, which I can read, none of it in order, photographs, around 3,000, notebooks and journals, diaries and memoirs, 20 or more, and letters, 4,000 letters, written mainly during the late 20s, 30s, and 40s, as well as some written earlier and later than that. The principal correspondent, Gertrude Wiebe-Reimer, was born in 1884 in Fischau, Molochna, a territory now occupied by Russia, claimed as their own by Putin. She immigrated to Winnipeg in 1926 and died in Kitchener, Ontario in 1988 at the age of 103. Even though she was writing in a culture that did not sanction women's ambition, Gertrude was neither silent nor stoic. She was an informed, opinionated woman with a proto-feminist sensibility. Few Grote Mana, prominent men in her Mennonite world, passed through town without choosing to spend a few hours in conversation with her. She was, after all, known within her community for being perceptive, articulate, and politically alert on various fronts. In her 1905 journal, the 21-year-old Gertrude regrets having grown up fatherless, but her single mother was well enough connected that Gertrude remembers being tutored by the great historian P.M. Friesen, a family friend. Mr. Friesen gave us lessons in Russian and German, she wrote. Every day we all went out into the steppe. Oh, how wonderful that was. Gertrude would have loved to have carried on her studies, but the challenging conditions of her life led her to take on the role of a seamstress, a trade she practiced for a few years on the Steinbach estate, the model for the estate in Sander Berzel's Russlander, where she was much beloved by her employees, the Schmidt family, who invited only she among the household staff to join them at the family table. It was at Steinbach that she met her husband Gerhard W. Reimer, a Reiseprediger, an itinerant minister, who had been educated in Hamburg and Berlin. Gertrude and Gerhard married in 1904 and had 7 children, the youngest of whom was 6, when Gerhard died suddenly of pneumonia and left Gertrude, a 47-year-old widow, in 1931. Past and future, I discovered while preparing these remarks, incessantly intertwine and relentlessly inform each other. Here's an instance where past and present intersect. Gertrude Wiebe-Reimer wrote eloquently in Die Mennonitische Rundschau of her husband's death in 1931. The day he became ill, he had spent with Jakob H. Janssen, a very important figure in the history of Mennonite writing. As I observed in my introduction to the 1988 anthology of Mennonite short stories, Liars and Rascals, Janssen played a prominent role in giving shape to the promising Mennonite literary culture that had emerged in the German-speaking Russian Mennonite colonies in the late 1800s. He emigrated to Canada in 1924 and was throughout his life a prolific writer and champion of the arts. In fact, he was the liar, the writer of fictions that I referred to in the title of that book of short stories. Like Arnold Dick, Janssen urged the Mennonites of Canada during the 20s, 30s, and 40s to embrace their community's capacity for artistic expression. On this matter, he was, alas, in large measure ignored. The 40-some chapbooks he published in his lifetime remain to be examined as literature. As for Gertrude, a committed writer, not only of letters, she regularly contributed articles to the Mennonite periodicals of her day. The fact that she had a public audience was confirmed in letters from friends and relatives who would comment on the impact of her most recently published piece. Her story as a life writer is ripe for discovery. 14. Today we live at what Stephen Greenblatt has called daring intersections of multiple identities. And we are hugely blessed by that multiplicity. The fact that Mennonite literature, insofar as it is multilingual, for example, or multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial, etc., isn't always nor necessarily legible as Mennonite literature, need not lead any of us to pretend that we are without distinctive language, culture, sexual orientation, ethnicity, or race. Mennonite writers do not share a single fable of identity, but we have shared and remain poised to share our diverse narratives. We have consistently come to events like this in play, ready to create a future apart from notions of causality, continuity, coherence, teleology, or authenticity. This is a Mennonite or a literary community, a big tent that includes texts and everything and everyone around them. In my opening remarks at that first conference 32 years ago, I declared that I had come to listen. At events like this, we listen to each other, learn from each other, affirm each other, find common ground, and celebrate our differences. In 2018, Jessica Penner remarked on how nice it was that before she read her piece at the last Mennonites Writing Conference, she did not have to spend a few minutes outlining what Mennonites were about. She could, she declared, just assume that most of the audience would already have a basic knowledge so that she could simply dive into the heart of the story. I give thanks that even with the knowledge that we are so varied and diverse in so many ways, we remain hospitable to each other, knowing that we do hold a lot in common, not least our interest in what we embrace or at least recognize as Mennonites writing. And we don't even demand of each other what, as individuals, we might mean by that term. Finally, there's no more palpable and so far more abiding marker of that thing we call Mennonites writing than these events, this project, where we gather to read and talk to each other, to listen and to celebrate. Let's keep it going. Thank you.